Chairman.
Mine, as is mine.
And here's my question. Let me try to rephrase it. And I really do wish, I understand the position you're in, but you really should try to do a better job of answering the questions. Under the Biden administration, we have the most encounters. We have had the most encounters with people attempting to come into our country illegally in the history of ever. Under the Biden administration, we have had the most people entering our country illegally in the history of ever. Under the Biden administration, we have had the most gotaways at our southern border in the history of ever. Under the Biden administration, we have had the most number of people entering our country under a claim of asylum, having that claim turned down and still not being deported in the history of ever. And under the Biden administration, we've had the most fentanyl coming into our country in the history of ever. How can you possibly say the southern border is secure? I understand your answer that you're trying, but I'm not asking about your efforts. I'm asking about the results.
Well, let's talk about the results then, Senator. Do you know that last year we expelled and removed approximately 1.4 million people from the southern border? I believe that's the most ever. Do you realize that we are focused on enforcing our laws to achieve the security of the southern border?
I know you're focused, Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Secretary, but you're not succeeding.
Senator,
and when you come testify to us, you talk about how you're trying really hard. And I don't have any way to disprove that. I accept that statement in good faith. But the numbers belie that.
If I can, Senator, let me give you an example of a solution that we have delivered that for some reason is being contested. Because it's caused a 95.
I give you 30 seconds, okay?
It's caused a 95.
Don't filibuster me. You've been doing that all day. I'm just trying to ask
I'm just trying to communicate. It has led to a approximately 95% drop in the number of encounters in between the ports of entry at our southern border of Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans.
Mr. Secretary,
on January 5th.
Mr.
And why would that be opposed when it is delivering precisely the result that you seek?
Did you just parachute in from another planet, Mr. Secretary? Because you're the only person in the Milky Way who believes that we're not having massive illegal immigration into America.
Senator, you're putting words into my mouth.
No, sir, I'm accurately describing the situation.
There is no question that we have a very serious challenge at our southern border.
Okay.
It is a challenge.
We can agree on that. Let me ask you another question. Why don't you just declare a new policy that other than children, if you present at the southern border, you claim refugee status, you claim political asylum, and you haven't claimed refugee status and political asylum at the first safe country, then you can't come in.
Senator, so first of all, when one presents at the border, it's an asylum claim, not a refugee.
But why don't you do that? Why don't you just unilaterally declare that a safe third country policy? It would work. You can't come into America. If you're coming from Venezuela and you come through Mexico, if you didn't claim asylum in Mexico, you can't come here. You have to leave. Why don't you just do that?
Well, Senator, let me give you an example with respect to Mexico. A safe third country agreement, let's hypothetically assume—
You don't have to have an agreement with Mexico.
Yes, you do.
No, you don't.
I believe you do, Senator.
No, you don't. Other countries don't do it. Just adopt a policy that says, except for children, because you don't want to send children back by themselves. Just adopt a new policy that if you didn't seek asylum in the first safe third country, you can't come in, period.
Senator, are you aware of the notice of proposed rulemaking that we issued, the comment period of which closed yesterday?
You've had 2 years to adopt a policy like I just described. Why haven't you done it?
So, Senator, what we have done is
But why haven't you done that?
we have surged enforcement resources. We have
Why haven't
developed.
you just adopted? Please, if you would, Mr. Secretary, answer my question.
It is my understanding.
Why haven't you adopted unilaterally a safe third country policy? That would stop, except for children, all the folks from the Northern Triangle countries, all the folks from Venezuela, all the folks from Cuba, all the folks from the Middle East from coming into our country. Why haven't you done that?
Senator, it's my understanding that those two things. It is my understanding that those agreements do require.
You don't have to have an agreement with anybody. It can be a policy established by the Department of Homeland Security.
Senator, I'd have to review the.
You haven't reviewed that? You haven't considered that possibility?
Let me finish, if I may.
Sure.
I would have to review the legal underpinnings of your assertion.
Well, you better get reviewing.
And I also
you ought to get reviewing. This is the first time that's occurred to you.
I also do not think that that is sound policy.
You don't think this is the first time that's occurred to you?
I also do not think that that is sound policy, that we should shut down our entire asylum system.
I didn't say shut down the entire asylum system. I said safe third country. All you have to do, Mr. Secretary, if you're really serious, and it's beginning, frankly, to appear that you're not, is adopt a policy that says we're not seeking anyone's agreement. We don't have to. If you're coming from another country and you come through, let's say, Mexico, and you say you're seeking asylum, you have to seek it in Mexico or the other first safe third country, or you can't come in. Period. Done. End of story. Why don't you do that?
Senator, I don't think that we have the unilateral authority.
Sure you do. Other countries do it.
Number one and number two, as I've
mentioned.
mentioned.
Try sneaking into China.
As I've mentioned, I do not think that is sound policy.
Why?
Because you are basically shutting down our asylum system.
No, you're not. You're saying we honor your right to seek political asylum. But you're cherry picking. Do it in Mexico first. Why haven't you done that? 55%. And that doesn't even count the additional $500 billion worth of spending that the president has just proposed. I also learned that the president is proposing $4.7 trillion, not billion, $4.7 trillion in new taxes. Takes my breath away. $4.7 trillion. We're going to run out of digits. And I also learned something else. You know, the president, and I say this gently and with respect, the president has been running all over hell and half of Georgia saying my proposed budget decreases the deficit by $3 trillion. You probably heard him say that. I heard him say it day before yesterday. My proposed budget will cut debt by $3 trillion. You know what I learned today about the president's proposed budget? Under his proposed budget, gross debt, that's all of America's debt, not just debt held by the public, but gross debt, all of our debt will rise under President Biden's budget from $32.7 trillion at the close of this year to $51 trillion by 2033. Only in Washington, D.C., only in La La Land, can you go around and say, my budget reduces the deficit and debt by $3 trillion when it really increases it by $18 trillion? $18 trillion. I've also learned a lot this week about Silicon Valley Bank. I think I spoke, Mr. President, I don't know, a week, maybe 10 days ago. Gosh, we've learned a lot in a week. One of the things that we have learned is that the failure of Silicon Valley Bank and President Biden's bailout of Silicon Valley Bank was the result of bad management by the bank officials, but also by bad supervision. I talked about a week or two ago about the risk that the management of SVB Bank took, but today, this is what I learned this week. I want to talk about the mistakes that were made by the federal government in supervising this bank. Fact number one. It is a fact that in January of 2019, the Federal Reserve, which is one of the banking regulators in charge of supervising the bank, issued a warning to the bank. This is 4 years ago, over its risk management systems. 4 years ago, the Fed told Silicon Valley Bank that its system to control risk was not up to snuff. Fact number two. Last fall, short sellers and private bank analysts said the same thing. What, 5 months ago? 6 months ago? Fact number three. Some of my colleagues have said, you know, we didn't have sufficient regulation. I don't know how you regulate greed. I don't know how you regulate stupidity, but I'm referring now to the management of Silicon Valley Bank. But it wasn't a failure of regulation that caused Silicon Valley Bank to go under. It was the failure to enforce the rules that we already have. I just explained to you, here's the article from the Wall Street Journal. The Federal Reserve, one of the banking regulators in charge of Silicon Valley Bank, knew in January of 2019, the bank was criticized for its risk control practices. And they were supposed to correct those risk control practices. Why didn't the Federal Reserve follow up? Now, I also learned, some of my colleagues are saying, well, you know, this is all the fault of Congress. It's the fault of Congress because Silicon Valley Bank was not subject to a stress test. We, as you know, Democrats and Republicans supported an amendment to Dodd-Frank back in 2018 that some say prevented the bank from being stress tested. That's not true. The bill that we passed in 2018 said categorically and unequivocally, look at Title 12, Chapter 2, Subchapter A, Part 252, Subpart A, Section 252.3. It said in our legislation that the Federal Reserve and the other banking regulators had the authority at any time to stress test Silicon Valley Bank, and they chose not to do it. Now, the other point being made by some of my colleagues is that, well, they weren't big enough to stress test. They had to be $100 billion or more. That's not true. They were over a $100 billion bank at the end of 2021. So they did qualify to be stress tested in 2022. One of the other things we've learned, Mr. President, is that in 2022, the Federal Reserve stress tested 34 banks. Silicon Valley Bank was not one of them, as I said. They could have been. Under the rules, they qualified. They were supposed to be. They were over $100 billion. And even had they not been over $100 billion, the Federal Reserve could have said, we're going to stress test them anyway under our legislation. Because back in February or January of 2019, we were worried about their risk control. But for whatever reason, we're going to find out, the Federal Reserve chose not to stress test them. The Federal Reserve issued a report on its stress tests from 2022. Here it is. If the Federal Reserve had stress tested Silicon Valley Bank, Silicon Valley Bank would have passed. It would have passed. You know why? Because the Federal Reserve, in its stress testing in 2022, didn't stress test interest rate risk. They just stress tested credit risk. I just find that extraordinary. In 2022, we were experiencing raging inflation. The Fed was raising interest rates. The Fed understands that when you hold a long government bond or a long treasury, that its value decreases as interest rates go up. You would think that the first thing the Federal Reserve would stress test for was interest rate risk and duration risk. But it didn't. It didn't, and I am at a loss to understand. Mr. President, now the Federal Reserve has announced, I think the Vice Chairman of the Federal Reserve, Mr. Barr, has announced that he's going to be in charge of finding out what went wrong. And Mr. Barr's a fine person, and nothing I say today should be construed to suggest that he's not. But Mr. Barr has a conflict of interest. His own agency contributed to the downfall of Silicon Valley Bank. It wasn't a question of something that Congress did or didn't do. Under the regulations we passed, we put the Federal Reserve in charge of checking these banks for duration or interest